Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to Strictly Speaking. I'm Joshua Reaves. I'm the Director of University Theater here at NC State. Tonight, I would like to welcome our guest, RASEAN DAVONTE Johnson. Welcome to Strictly Speaking. Hope you're doing well. Yeah?
I'm doing all right. All things considered.
Yeah, great. Well, yes, all things. So let's go ahead and jump into it. You are a video artist and projection designer, among many other things. But in your own words, can you go ahead and tell us what it means to be a video artist or a projection designer?
Well, I mean, I think those are two separate things that I've kind of embraced over a period of time. I kind of got started in video art, and I think a huge component of that is people who are interested in breaking stuff, and and I mean that in a way of, there's kind of the contextual use of video. You watch TV, you watch film, and I actually had an opportunity to work in broadcast television. I felt like in my journey in that world was not necessarily satisfying, and the things that I was really interested in were the things that were in theory wrong. Like, why would you use the scale in this way? Why would you feedback video like this? You're going to break the computer. And it's like, well, actually, this is more interesting. This looks really evocative. And those are the things that I'm actually interested in versus, whether or not the formatting is correct. So in that sense, I feel like that is one definition of video art. And then in terms of projection design, that kind of harkens back to this concept of what is, this idea of ephemeral imagery in the theater. In some ways, lighting has a graphical component to it, but it also carves out the actors in the space. But projections in a lot of ways is utilizing whether it's shadow or complete image in part of this kind of performance space. So in one ways, I feel like video art is more contained within kind of the experimentation of what a video is, and projections is more of like, what is that in the context of an overarching story and in performance. So
okay. No, that's great. Thank you so much. And well, tell us how did you get started in, at least for us, in the theater world? Like, how did you get to that overarching storytelling?
Totally, yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I started 12 years ago, kind of experimenting with it. And like I said before, I was kind of doing more video art. I actually studied in theater to be an actor. And the biggest thing that I wanted to get an opportunity to do was act. I felt like if I filmed myself acting in my pieces, then at least that's some form of acting. That kind of led me to do a lot more short films, whether to start myself or other people. I was working in broadcast television at a PBS station. And so I felt like my world was going in this, whether it was video art or if it was broadcast television or filmmaking, I was going in that route. A friend of mine in school was wanting to incorporate video into their thesis project. And because of my, adherence to our theater program at school, but also kind of touching into this video world, I was kind of the likely candidate because we didn't have any sort of projection program at our school. So playing around with that kind of caught me onto getting involved in theater and projection design and specifically. And that kind of led me to Chicago. So I started to do a lot more experimental work there. And that led me to go into grad school to kind of get an MFA in it. So that was my journey. And that kind of got me, touched my toe in the theater world.
Gotcha. And before we jump into the theater world and into your current work, your work in broadcast television, was it, what exactly were you doing? Was it graphic art? Was it, what were you working on?
Well, I was a student assistant, which really meant that you did a lot of different things. But what was cool was the station was, I wouldn't say it was super small, but it wasn't large at all. So even though I was kind of just an assistant, I did get an opportunity to do like a great, very many things, which is actually very important in terms of projection design in general, like your ability to kind of cross-pollinate and be able to say, well, for this show I need this, and for this show I need this. I got a chance to do Chiron graphics, whether it was live or for videotape. I did linear tape editing for a couple different programs. I ran the camera. I ran robotic cameras. I was the stage manager, which for TV meant that like you were on the radio and then you had to be behind the camera and like give people the numbers. I did technical direction, which for that meant that you were the switcher for the director. I was the assistant director, which meant that you had to kind of track the script and let the director know about time. So it was really interesting to get an opportunity to delve into all those things. And it also was just, helping pack stuff up and, send cables onto a truck, and doing live shoots and film shoots. So it was a great variety of things that I got a chance to do at that broadcast station.
Well, I'd say, looking at your work, I mean, you have such a wide breadth of different modes of art. So, I mean, I could certainly see how, being behind the camera and also, framing the shots, but also giving the shots, I can see how that comes through in your work. So talk to us a bit about, what is a typical day for you? And let's take it from the projection designer role. Like, what is a typical day for you? And
this is obviously pre-COVID, right?
Go with that for now. Yeah.
I'll talk about what I'm doing right now. But before, I mean, I think the biggest thing was managing, the different productions that's happening at once. I think the typical day kind of bounced between whether or not I was in tech. So if I'm not in tech, I'm building content for a show, I'm building storyboards for another show, I'm researching another, reading another script, whether it's a show that's several months in advance or the show next week. I'm trying to manage that schedule. So I'm building the schedule from the beginning of the day. I oftentimes try to do any sort of reading at the beginning of the day so I can have a little fresh of a mind in terms of that. And then I kind of spread out everything else, whether it's meetings for a particular production meetings, design meetings. I try to prep all of those things beforehand as well. And then I leave a lot of my content building towards the end of the night, where I don't have to necessarily concentrate too much in terms of specifics and more just kind of creatively work through things. That would, I would say, be a general busy day. Obviously, things, vary in their degrees, whether or not I'm shooting something for a particular production, or whether or not I'm trying to give myself a day off and I might just research all day. So, but in a kind of normal busy day, that's kind of how I structure things.
Okay. And everyone, remember, Q&A is open, so be sure to throw some questions out there for Davonte. Davonte, you mentioned sometimes you're shooting for work that goes into a theatrical or an operatic or a dance or whatever it may be. How much shooting or how much original content do you create to throw onto the stage?
I mean, it depends on the show. I feel like there's a wide range of opportunity for those type of things. There's kind of two different terms for the type of projections that I generally see in plays, and one is dialectic and the other is diegenic. Or didactic. I'm sorry, not diegenic. Didactic is usually in terms of news footage, things that are topical of the time, information that people need to see, whether it's titles. Those type of things are mostly found footage, or if it is something that I generate, it's just text. So in those circumstances, those are kind of just generated on itself or found. But when it comes to be something much more interesting, I feel like the dialectic sort of work can have a larger breadth of opportunity, whether or not you're going out to try to shoot a scene which is supposed to be a backdrop for the environment, or you're incorporating actors to be some sort of abstract amorphous body in the background. That's when it starts to get into that kind of work. But it depends on the show, because in my if I had my druthers, I would love to shoot a lot of content for every show that I did, but if I have a show that's taking place in, you know, Juarez, Mexico, I'm not necessarily going to go down there and shoot that footage. So it just depends, you know.
Gotcha. And so, you know, just to give everyone a idea of your type of work, I'm going to go ahead and roll your video that's the top of your website. We can continue to talk as we view this. So, if you could, you know, as we go through this, just kind of tell us what's you know, what show we're looking at and what's going on.
Sure, yeah. So this is Cymbeline, and this was kind of my main stage production at Yale School of Drama, where I went to get my MFA. This was an interesting production because we were wanting to explore the use of fog and projection. So this is one of the examples of that. This is a dance piece that's exploring the moment someone has a stroke. So we're incorporating some abstract images as well as medical imagery with the dancer. This was my thesis project, and I was playing with the idea of magicians and how can projections kind of be evocative of that. This is a dance piece that I did in China, and we did a lot of elemental pieces with that, with a lot of other things that we shot. You might be able to see it on my website. This goes back to Cymbeline. This is another kind of exploration of the fog. We actually did this shoot scene where we made ghosts appear on the stage, which was really fun. And then I try to go into different kind of modes of like getting an opportunity to project on the floor for this play about a serial killer. I like to evoke the idea of shadows into my work, and so instead of trying to show the literal thing, I'll show the shadow of it. This is some more kind of literal sort of stuff where you see the internet, the use of LEDs. I try to make it more like a light instrument instead of just showcasing images. I try to go with the show, create animations that are really in sync with what's happening on stage. And so this is a fight scene that's it's very dramatic. And then the same thing goes here, where I try to follow what the actor's doing. So I had this actor paint this tag on stage. This is the play House of Spirits, where we made the dog invisible but saw his steps. I like getting an opportunity to project on actors, so we projected rain on these actors, which was really fun. And then this goes back to my thesis project, where actually in front, instead of being a scrim, it's actually a frosted piece of glass, where that gives an opportunity to see an image. Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of the full exploration of trying to play around with fog in a show, and so we were projecting onto a bird onto that fog curtain there. A lot of different things playing around with in the shows that I try to do.
So I would love to go back to that. It was the fight scene you mentioned. So I'm a lighting designer by trade, and I know that when I or the sound designer or even the projection designer can get into a rehearsal early on and allow that interaction to happen, the show, you know, is better off for it. How often and how much are you able to provide content or provide input so early on to allow the actors to manipulate and or play with your work?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the biggest thing is like the mode of operation. So I'll get to that particular example in a second, but I work with a group called Manual Cinema, and they work very integrated with the work that they do. They're a shadow puppet group, and for that they have a kind of a whole system of filming and recording their work, so that's part of their rehearsal process. So I try to provide the system for them to use in that circumstance. But that's for a kind of a very integrated process. For this particular production, you know, there's a different way to go about it. And for this, I did a lot of different research and kind of understanding what the changes in the fight scene were. So talking with the director with what is the stage of the fight? So is this the first stage where these characters come on and they're kind of in the beginning of the fight, and then what is this level up to? And so where are we when we level up? We're obviously in the same location, but has the location changed? Has the color changed? And then just knowing where the fight goes and progresses can be in and of itself kind of like its own way of storyboarding the ideas without having to being able to say, hey, here's the content. Because what I found is that oftentimes when I create content for a rehearsal, sometimes that can hinder things, and they'll make their fight scene to the video, where once you see it in the actual theatrical space, you're like, oh, well, actually, it just needs to condense. And it's really hard to have that conversation where you're like, well, I know I made this video, but I'm going to shorten it. Can you shorten your choreography? I would rather have it the opposite way, where they decided to shorten it and I can easily shorten mine. So I try to keep things as loose as I can, show influences, give research, maybe show just a little bit of the content that I'm playing around with, but keep them in a space where they feel like they still have freedom to make choices versus to be locked into any video that I make.
Right. So we have Noelle asking a question. How do you find inspiration when you come across a project that is really unfamiliar to you or might not exist in the real world?
Well, I mean, going back to my beginnings in this kind of work, I think a huge influence for myself was film. I watched a lot of movies as a kid, and I think that no matter what script I read or what story I read, I have some sort of visual image of what would that look like if that was a movie. And I think that even harkens back to when I was really little and I read comic books. You know, back then there were like the comic book movies that were out at that time were so bad that you just only had your imagination really to give you a good example of what it could really be. So that kind of opportunity of dreaming just stayed with me throughout my life, where I would read something and be like, wow, I wonder what that would actually look like. Getting an opportunity to read more about art history and theory has kind of expanded my dramaturgical sense of like what it exactly might be interesting thematically for the show. And there's oftentimes a visual reference to that dramaturgical observation. If there's a war, there was probably an artist who was influenced by that war, and they probably have some work that's relative to it. And you can go back in history for that. If it's something in the future, you know, there's so many topics about all the different types of futures that people can imagine that you can pull from any one of those and say, hey, this is something that I know about and influenced me. And whether or not anyone in the design team has saw that or even agrees with that is another piece of that visual puzzle that will give to the meat of the whole design of the project. So that's kind of like the thing that I kind of pull out is just like all the things that I've seen. I always try to see like, what would I think this would look like? And then find a dramaturgical package, find a inspirational package and say, hey, look, this sounds interesting. This is something that I was looking at, and just present it.
Great. So you mentioned comic book movies when you were growing up and how, you know, obviously we've gone a long way. In your time as a visual artist, has the technology changed your artistry over your career now that you can do more, I guess, or, you know, how has it affected that?
You know, it's really interesting in that I've almost, it's not that I've regressed. It's just that I've gone back to more analog ways of doing things because of the progression of everything. It's so easy to capture minutia anymore. You can film yourself drawing something really easily. You just get out your phone. If you can lock your phone in, then you're even better. And that kind of natural texture is going to lend you something much more interesting than you creating it in After Effects. But at the same time, if you do something like that, then when you manipulate it with After Effects, then you can get to an even higher level of stuff. So I've started to explore more analog ways of doing things because it's so easy and cheap to record things. Before, you had to buy tape and all that other stuff. And the ability to save things in really large files, that's a huge benefit as well. You can shoot and record as much as you want. But the thing is that there's so much that you can gain from these kind of older technologies that now that you're able to kind of mash it all together, you can get yourself to a much more interesting place because of the progression of technology, not necessarily because the old way's better or the new way's better.
And to follow up with that, we have another question. What is typically the most challenging part of creating animation?
Well, I think animation in general, there's kind of a through line of just like, how do you connect one thing to the other? That's in and of itself very difficult. But I think for the stage, what makes animation very difficult is understanding the flow of the show. Animation is all about, in a lot of ways, about timing, how you perceive motion, how motion is conveyed, how things get animated. And that rhythm has its own kind of energy. And if you were to create something too well beforehand for a show, and then you realize, let's say you read the play and then you made this like bouncing ball, the director's like, I want this bouncing ball in the show. And you make this digital bouncing ball, and you're like, well, I want the actors to interact with this bouncing ball. And so you make this bouncing ball, you send them the footage, and they realize like, hey, look, so in rehearsal, we were deciding to make everyone act really slow. We're having a whole different perspective on this. So I want the bouncing ball to be slow. Well, you're like, okay, well, I'll make it slow. But then when you actually see it in person, you're like, well, actually, it's kind of an in-between. And obviously, changing a bouncing ball is pretty easy. But the reality is that you're not in your own box. It's a collaborative art. And creating something with a group of people in terms of animation is very difficult in and of itself. That if you were by yourself and you knew exactly what the beginning and end of something is, you've got a little bit more control on what you're trying to say. But oftentimes, what you create beforehand is not what it's going to be on opening night, and that kind of turnaround makes it for a very challenging aspect of this whole kind of process.
And do you have a story of one of your most challenging shows, whether it be from the pre-production or during the actual tech process itself or getting to open night?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, this is a long time ago, and it was for one of the my favorite shows. I was co-designing with a collaborator of mine, Anna Henson, which I ended up doing a show in China with her. And that was also a co-design. But this particular production was really interesting. And there was like, I would say, multiple heads to this beast. One of them was the fact that we had come into this project fairly late in the process, and there was someone whose work we were getting an opportunity to use, and we were basically just kind of editing it. The reality was that once we actually set up the system that they provided, it had kind of gone by the wayside. There was a rated drive that just essentially failed on one of the tech nights. So our options were either we tried to go and save this rated drive, which it was not salvageable, or we recreate everything in the show. And that was a really eye-opening opportunity, because not only did that mean that whatever was previously thought had to be kind of revisualized, the director and choreographer saw us as an opportunity to, well, it's like, hey, well, I wanted to do this one section in the show. Now we can actually redo it, and we don't even have to worry about, because we're going to do it again anyway. So he went out, he shot this thing where he jumped in underwater. We were in the middle of re-rendering a bunch of other stuff for the different scenes. We came back. We kind of just threw it up there and saw if it worked or not. And then we had another day of just turning it around and seeing what that did. And it was the most freeing and experimental process, because it wasn't about, what we did in pre-production to see if, this lined up with that and, this whole large process. It was literally just playing around with the imagery that we had and were inspired by when we saw the show in its final form. Obviously, that's not necessarily the way you should do things, but it was a moment where that turnaround time really illuminated the opportunities that oftentimes you may lose when you think about a thing too long. Sometimes just what is your first impulse is always a really interesting thing. So.
Yes, my colleagues and I, we always say Remember that thing we thought about at the beginning when we first started out? Now we're going back to that, and that's what ends up on stage.
Yeah, totally.
But since we can't do things that way and we do them the typical way, or at least the old typical, an anonymous attendee asks, how often do you sit in on rehearsals and meet with directors to secure their exact vision?
I mean, as often as I can. I would say kind of the rate at which I do things is, I get accepted to do a show. I obviously have a initial conversation with the director, hopefully, and they'll tell me exactly what they're thinking about, and I'll tell them what I thought about in terms of what the projections do in the show. It's always an interesting conversation because most of the time everyone always comes from a different aspect, and if projections are written in the show, there's oftentimes this really weird perspective of what playwrights think video does, which is a whole other conversation. But then after that kind of initial conversation, try to do a follow-up conversation where I've made some storyboards, gathered some research, and then we can kind of talk about what exactly the beats are in the show visually. From there, you have your first rehearsal, you have your design presentation, and I obviously try to sit in on that. And then towards the latter part of the rehearsal process, I try to show up as many times as I can because that's when things are really getting interesting before they do the designer run, because they've talked through the show, they've kind of learned the lines, they've got the blocking. Now they're like problem solving, and it's really interesting to see the actors problem solve, because then for myself, the biggest thing for projections for me is how you transition, and they're figuring out how they transition emotionally. And that quotient is really interesting because then you can say to yourself, oh, they're dealing with these type of emotional content. And I always applied this kind of emotive quality to the work that I do versus like whatever is technically there. And if I can pinpoint what they're going through and put that with the work that I'm doing, there's a bigger connection to what is happening cohesively on stage. So, but I try not to do it too much in the beginning because they're just kind of doing their own actor thing. So.
And Noelle's asking again, another question. Have you ever run into a situation where existing technology restricts your creative vision?
I mean, sure. I think the thing is, though, the circumstances that at least I've come up against has not necessarily entailed me thinking too much larger than the means that are available. I mean, I'm not necessarily out there trying to, project onto a waterfall and expect, I'm going to get anything out of it with a small projector. I'm like, oh, well, I know I need this to do that. If I can't get that, then we shouldn't do it in the first place. But that being said, I don't know. I mean, we went for a lot of different things in the show Cymbeline that you saw some clips from, where the challenge was, can we make a large fog curtain? You see fog curtains for like Halloween shows. And but the idea of having one that's like half the stage and over almost 50 feet tall is not necessarily something you see every day. But part of it was figuring out whether or not that challenge could be met, and if that challenge is too far off from the budget of the show. Because I would say that most things, within reason, are possible. Not asking to project onto the moon, but if you have enough money, you could do most things. So really, it's more about what's your budget. And I could say that I have not had that much of budget for my shows to say that, I'm not getting what I expected. But that being said, for this particular projection, we did have a challenge that no one had really done before at this institution. And I think we faced it head on to see if we can really pull it off. And I was satisfied by the results. We got a chance to project on fog to make a waterfall, which looked really fun.
That's what we're looking at right here.
Yeah.
This looks great.
And then the bird that there was an example of at the end was really fun as well. So I was really happy about those results. I think really what it comes down to then is just getting an opportunity to explore it more, which it just comes down to money. So.
And with this particular production, what are we looking at here? Are you how many projectors were you using in this, and how much time in rehearsal was devoted to these moments?
Yeah, so I could say that, let me see, there was one projector that was hitting the bottom half of the stage, and then there was two blended projectors for the upper half. So if you see this image, that upper half are two blended projectors, and then the bottom half is one 18K projector. The bird effect that happens at the end there, that was two blended projectors on a fog curtain. And there were a couple things that was on that fog curtain, but that was those components. We did several filmed components of the show where we had those ghosts, and that was a certain portion of the rehearsal process that we utilized. And there were some other things that we had shot for the show that more or less got into the show. We did some effects that we shot. But in terms of, how much was devoted into that, I mean, we knew going into it that it was going to be kind of a process where we were utilizing almost like a visual effects studio. Mm-hmm. And so we went into it with that kind of plan. Not every show has that kind of scope for it. So, but that was for that one particularly.
Well, it's a beautiful show. However, we had another question that might take us to a different show. What is your dream production to work on? What is the one effect or projection that you would love to create?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of different ideas that I've always floated around. Whether or not there's a particular production that utilizes it, I'm always a fan of older plays, classics. Shakespeare is really great to explore projection design in, despite the fact that I think that most theaters do Shakespeare as like a budgetary thing. Like they'll be like, oh, well, let's just do a Shakespeare play. We don't need that much. You could go so deep with a Shakespeare play because there's so many things that Shakespeare touches upon in the script. You can take one little piece out and say, hey, look, let's just like focus on this, and we can really blow it up. That being said, whether or not that ties into any effect, I've always wanted to project onto water. People would project on the ice and all these other things. But I think specifically, getting an opportunity to get a large, thing of water, fill it maybe with some something that gives it a little less clarity, mm-hmm. and seeing what that might actually do. And I think there's a really fun effects that you can do with that. We've always seen what light does on water, but I think that there's opportunities with that. But that comes down to, whether or not there's a show that I'm going to do with a giant sheet of water. So that's that. But yeah, I mean, and there's a ton of other stuff. I'm always looking for different materials and different modes of viewing and watching projected imagery.
And this also talk about what you might like to do. What have you done that was your favorite project?
I mean, I think Cymbeline was up there. I really had a lot of fun getting an opportunity to do that. Outside of Cymbeline, in terms of, are you asking in terms of challenge and projecting on, or just in general?
Honestly, it's from one of our attendees. So let's go with what was the most fulfilling? What was the most the one you liked yourself?
And there really is a lot, but I will go for the overall experience, and that is the show that I did in China, which the context of which was quite fantastical. The whole process was where I attended rehearsal every day. That was part of my my job there. We were chauffeured around to everything that we did. And outside of that, we only had a day to actually tech the show. We were there for 3 weeks to observe rehearsal. We only had tech time for a day. And when I say a day, I mean, we got in at 9. Everything wasn't ready until 12. And we were done at 5. The next day we had 2 hours of tech, and then there was a show.
Is this by chance on your website?
Oh yeah, that was Farewell My Concubine.
All right. Is that under theater or?
It's opera and dance.
Cool.
But despite all of those things, it's similar to the circumstance where I was talking about before, where the show that I had done had very limited tech time because the computer that we had gotten had crashed with all the content that we didn't create.
That's cool.
So we had to create stuff from brand new. This is a very similar circumstance where we were under a very odd circumstance, and then that circumstance led us to a really special place in terms of the work that we got a chance to present. And I will have to say that the performers there were quite extraordinary. They did all the scene changes. There was no crew. The dancers were the crew. But then they, whether or not they were bringing props on stage or they did a giant number, it was quite impressive. So,
wow, now, this is great.
And for this particular one, this was a front 30K projector and a rear 30K projector. The size of the theater was, I would say, 3/4 the size of the Met.
Okay.
And this was in a constructed city. So no one lived in this city that we went to, but they had this performance here to attract people to go to this theater.
Huh.
And this theater was not utilized very much. They had a lot of modern equipment, and it was a very interesting experience. I will say that.
Wow.
Very fun.
This picture right here, just the playing with scale and like depth just is really awesome, which leads me to my next question. So at least with me, I often find that, video and projection is an art form unto itself, but oftentimes it straddles that scenic or lighting. Do you find it, how do you work with your fellow designers to ensure that, what their work is complementing your work and vice versa?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I would say one of the most challenging things about projection design is the truth is you're always in everyone's business. You are all those components in a lot of different ways, and yet you cannot exist without collaboratively working with those components. I think in a lot of ways, some shows can get away with, two people not meeting, and then all of a sudden you take the show, and then it's like, oh, well, this is fine. But I can't show up and have all this content and not talk to the lighting designer and be like, hey, look, so I'm doing this thing at this point. Can we work around seeing how we can shape this and knowing where we're hitting and what we're hitting? Because then, all of a sudden everything's blown out and no one sees anything. Mm-hmm. And then you have a really sad conversation later between either one has to lose something. So that being said, it's like for a very cohesive design, I'm always talking with the lighting designer. I'm like, what kind of colors are we working with? Where are we hitting? Where are our kind of targets and what we're trying to illuminate? With the sound designer, I'm trying to figure out, what are we doing for transitions? How are we musically going through this scene? Can I have some of the music that you're writing? Can I edit to that? And with the scenic designer, I'm trying to figure out, what I'm projecting on. What could be some interesting surfaces? What can exist as one thing as well as another? Can we not just do a screen, which I always am sad to see. And I think finally, like working with a costume designer is also equally important. As much as it's important for me to shoot things, just to know their color palette. If there's a scene where there's just an actor on stage and there's a projection, the only other thing I can play off with is the costumes. So in a lot of ways, you're always kind of being tethered to all of these different conversations. And sometimes it's really fun because then you can say, hey, look, I had a conversation with the lighting designer. They were saying that they were going to do this. I think it'd be really cool if with sound, I'm going to do this at this point when they do this lighting thing. Maybe we have a sound that goes with that. That'd be really cool. So it's like you're really just trying to, jam with everybody. You're like the new band lead, bandmate, and you're just like, hey, look, I think we could do this new thing. It's going to be really cool. That's really the whole game, I think.
Yeah. And can I ask a follow-up question? That has there been a time where you had that sad conversation that you're willing to speak about?
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I think this is more from a place where I was asked to do a video for a show where I wasn't necessarily the projection designer. I was just asked by the theater to say, hey, we wanted to do this intro video for the show, but we don't really want projections for the rest of the show. Can we just like pay you for that? And I was like, yeah, sure. But the thing was that the projection surface that they thought was really interesting to use was actually being hit by the lights. And if they took the lights off, then they weren't lighting the actors. So they didn't really know what to do. So then we had to figure out another place to project the image. But then that took away whatever they thought was a really interesting scenic idea, and had to kind of had this conversation with the lighting designer, like, hey, look, we can't get rid of that or else we're not lighting the actors. What are we trying to do here? So, but that comes down to the fact that like this was something that they thought was really interesting to add at the last moment. And that those conversations that are super important in the beginning of like, what are we trying to do together, never happened. It was just like, oh, let's add some projections. And because I wasn't necessarily really involved in the show, I feel like that was a really big reason why that occurred.
Well, we have a little under 10 minutes left, everyone, so make sure you hit those questions with us. Davonte, as such a talented person across so many fields, you've got, work in video, photography, I see print material, projection film. Do you have a preferred way in which to express yourself?
I mean, I think that's a good question for me to just ask myself. I think I ask myself all that time. The truth is like, I've always been interested in, different things, whether or not it's drawing when I was younger and taking up photography later. The idea of getting a chance to record something was always interesting to me, and what the perception of that recording is. That's a lot of the reason why I'm interested in mediated mediums, and the fact that perception is a huge thing. I guess with that, it's just, what interests me at the time. I try not to think too much about it. But there are always things that makes me curious, how something works, what's a new technology that I can play around with, what looks interesting. In some ways, I wish it wasn't so much so, because I think that's a huge reason why the broadcast world didn't interest me as much. It was really difficult for me to just kind of do the same thing over and over again. So yeah, you end up having to live with the things that you have and learn to love them, and hopefully good things come out of them.
Well, let's talk a bit about the team that makes up a projection team. And I know, not all shows or all productions require it or are able to have them, but in the what I guess you would consider the dream team, what roles would there be, and what do those roles do?
Totally, yeah. So I think the first, I'll start from kind of an expansion point, where it's like, I think the most crucial team member is going to be your programmer. And I know that there's a lot of designers out there who have a hard time doing that, because there is a huge creative component to the idea of programming. It's not just like how you program a light board where, you're listening to the lighting designer and they're giving you kind of almost code. I do know that at certain levels, lighting designers will just kind of tell them what they want, and that's kind of the ideal circumstance, but that's not what all lighting programmers do or need to do. However, with projection programmer, that's almost essential, where you can't necessarily say, can you add this layer to here? Can you change the contrast to this? I mean, you make those kind of minutia choices after they've done the part, but you more or less say, hey, look, I have this new piece of media. Can you put this after this point, make this cues this, but then add some contrast adjustment for me? And then I'll take a look at it and be like, oh, well, that's interesting. Can you just lower the contrast by half? Because you can't necessarily get into that minutia, because they're creatively figuring out what you're asking for. Mm-hmm. But the opportunity to remove that section from your brain gives you more opportunity to create your content and talk to the director. the next level, in which I think will be really helpful when you're trying to build your team, is to add that person who's helping you make the content, because what yours should be operating from is a point of creativity, not necessarily of production. You know, the same thing as a scenic designer, where they have a model that they start off from. They're not the one who's building the sets or painting the drops. I mean, they might if they want to. And the same thing goes for myself. I oftentimes really like shooting the work, and I like editing that. But if I don't have to make a looping cloud, and all I have to do is tell them, like, this is the cloud that I want, could you make this loop? That just takes way more work off of me as well, which then just kind of siphons it back to saying, oh, well, now I get a chance to talk to the director about what I'm trying to say here, versus being in my computer all the time. So then, you know, building out from that, if I have another assistant who's like taking notes, who's like making sure they're tracking all the cues, that's a helpful person. And then on the back end, if I have someone who's solely devoted to animation for longer form projects, then I can say, hey, look, this is like a sequence that I want someone to build. You're really looking at yourself as more of the creative director of the projection team. And whenever you don't have those, at least kind of components to it, it makes things a lot more difficult. On the technical end, there's the projection engineer who's like making sure the system all works. I've worked plenty of shows where I did all those roles in one, and there is pride that comes with the opportunity of getting a chance to do that, and I've definitely enjoyed those shows. But at the same time, when it comes to producing either commercial production or something that is for a longer run, you definitely want to have an opportunity to really hone in on what are you creatively trying to say, versus like, why are you trying to be the Renaissance man for the show? So,
Well, tell us, for a young artist starting out, what software or hardware, going to the technical side for a moment, would you suggest they start with? Where should they spend their time with gear?
Totally, yeah. Well, I think at a certain point, it's helpful to realize that the creative process doesn't need you to know any specific software, just for you to know how to communicate. But when it comes to knowing how to use certain software to assist, to be able to collaborate with other people, knowing the Adobe suite for the field of projection is kind of essential, because despite the fact that there are many other softwares that can do that, knowing Final Cut, knowing anything else, Fusion, those are really helpful skills, especially if you know a 3D skill. But everyone uses Adobe Suite to take in media and alter it. And that's essentially what we're all doing. Whether we're shooting it or we're making it from scratch, knowing how to use After Effects, Photoshop, and Premiere are pretty important in terms of those things. On the hardware end of things, having your own camera is also equally important. Being able to shoot your own content is essential. Having, whether it's a SLR camera, a video camera, it can even be your phone, but I kind of want to shy away from phones unless it's intentional. Because you can make anything look like a cell phone video, but you can't make a cell phone video look like anything else. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know that the iPhone could do a lot of cool stuff, but there's a lot of auto settings and algorithmic magicry going with that, so it's not necessarily completely reliable. But having your own camera is good. If you want to invest in a playback system and you're going to be working in kind of smaller venues, having something that can play Isadora back is really important as well. But whatever that is, you want to make sure you can have as many outputs as you can. Finally, if you want to, investing in a projector is helpful, especially if you know that you might be doing some independent projects. Not having to ask someone for a projector is always a nice thing. But if you're working in the theatrical space, I always try to get the theater to either invest in a projector or find the projector themselves, because that route will become detrimental over time. especially if you're not investing in a very powerful or expensive projector. Those things just run out really quickly. But if you really want to make your own work, having a projector is also essential. So I would say those are the things.
That's great. Thank you. And the same question, but more about content. What should young artists study? Film, art, theater? What lessons were you taught or interests that you had that helped you along the way? Sort of like you said, you watched a lot of films, movies.
Totally, yeah. I mean, you know, I've met a lot of people with different backgrounds, and like I said, I've gravitated to the film kind of world. I know a lot of people who've come from the graphic design end of the spectrum, fine art end of the spectrum, photography. The commonality between everyone, though, is kind of two things. One is a general interest in history, because I feel like projection design especially is about giving context to the audience in whatever fashion, whether it's a historical context or a social context or a visual context. If you're trying to just orient people as to where they are, you have to know historically how people have viewed the world. And, you know, in a lot of ways, projection design is that element that is psychedelic, in the sense that it is a moving image that does not exist. So what are you trying to tell the audience? Are you trying to tell them that you're trying to see things? And if they are, what are they seeing? Are they seeing some sort of image that is trying to recall them from something they remember? Or are they seeing some sort of vision from the story that they're seeing? Whatever that is, it has some sort of historical context to how we perceive the world. So I think that an interest in history of some kind, I think is actually the most crucial element. And, you know, then there's kind of the visual components that bounce off of that, that become important as well. So.
Great. And then finally, for our last question, what is the one piece of advice you would give a person wanting to become a video artist or a projection designer?
My biggest piece of advice is actually watching what you invest in. The truth is that this industry contains technology that advances, you know, in some areas every 6 months, in other areas every 3 years. The truth is that you can't have everything, and there are only some things that you can invest in. So know what you're really interested in. If you know that you really like shooting video, then invest in a nice camera, because you know that you're going to use the camera a lot. If you know you like to make content, then invest in a really powerful laptop, because you know that you're going to need that to render things out. And when you start out, you should really focus on the things that you like, because you don't want to burn out on things you think other people you should like. So make sure that those things are really strong for you, because that'll maintain your interest. If you decide to change anything up in your life, you know you'll always have that nice thing that you bought for yourself. But really just watch what you invest in, because over time those investments is less about the objects and more about yourself. And you want to make sure you invest time in yourself in this profession, because that's the most important component to your creativity, is what you like.
It's so beautifully put, Davonte. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on Strictly Speaking. And thank you all for taking time out tonight to come by and listen to Davonte speak about his art.
For having me.
Yeah, thank you. We have a great number of events coming up this week and for the rest of the semester. And if you like what you saw tonight, please consider supporting University Theater by becoming a donor. Davonte, have a great night, stay safe, and thank you again for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.